that was another one. Because I talked about my own portfolio for the career project about how I invested in other people.
And I was so thankful to say there is one thing so far. You know the movie, right?
Yes.
No, I did not know but I was this whole time thinking about it. I was like, no, it's not like that.
No, I don't worry. I did not write mine.
I don't know if you guys sense of
I think he might. I was a little slow in my answers too, so I think
maybe next time.
maybe
for my research paper. Right. Yeah. Is this about the highlights? How you doing, Professor? Nice to see you.
I should stop circulating. Good. Yeah. No. It's harder to not. So you just have like less institutional knowledge. Yeah, I guess it would be like a very question, especially like what I don't think like how serious we just make a call or yeah, anyway, thanks for organizing. Put you all
Submit this at the end.
Yeah, I'll just go. Did anyone? Yeah, I'll just collect on the end of class whatever you have on that's how it goes.
Come closer if you like.
I should. What's your course?
There's
So I'll just collect it. Well, I think no, just
all right, good afternoon, everyone.
Hi, how you doing? Good. How you doing?
Okay, welcome to the Fall 2023 Economic Democracy Keynote. My name is Katerina Cherneva. I'm a professor of economics at Barton College, and I direct the Economic Democracy Initiative at the Open Society University Network. EDI, as we affectionately call it, began with a singular idea. And that idea is that integrating economic rights in economic policy is really the only way that we can move toward a more sustainable and just economic order. So today I'm very excited to introduce to you our keynote speaker, who has made economic rights a centerpiece of his scholarship. Dr. Mark Paul is an assistant professor at the Edward J. Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers. He is widely published, and his writings have appeared in outlets like the New York Times, the Economist, Financial Times, and others. Policy. He has consulted numerous levels. He has also testified multiple times before Congress. Before I give him the floor, I want to remind you of a quote by Franklin Delano Roosevelt from his speech, State of the Union address, in 1944, where he said, "We have come to the clear realization of the fact that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made." He argued at the time that the task of securing political rights may be long and challenging, but it will never be complete unless and until we also secure a second Bill of Rights, secure economic rights for all. In his vision for economic rights, he included the right to a job, the right to housing, to education, healthcare, etc. But Mark Hall, in his new book, re-envisions that framework for the 21st Law's promise for economic rights, in which he reminds us of this forgotten intellectual tradition. He makes a very compelling case for economic rights that is based both on good economics and good politics. In the words of Naomi Klein, the logic is irresistible. Without the embrace of substantive and well-guaranteed economic rights, democracy may not survive. So please join me in welcoming Mark Hall.
It's great to be here with you all. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. So, I just wanted to, first of all, thank Pavlina and Eddie for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, especially on this lovely fall afternoon. Really thrilled to be in the Hudson River Valley. My mom's family's from up here, so great to come back. I used to come up here all the time as a child. One thing I just wanted to say at the start, actually somebody was asking me about this before the talk, is that economics is no longer a book field. And I think that's a shame, because books provide us the opportunity to really flesh out our thoughts, our arguments, and our insights and struggles, intellectual struggles, in really great length, in ways that an article just can never let you do. And so I feel really privileged to have had the opportunity to write a book to really struggle with this idea of economic rights. And really, when I say economic rights, the core idea that I initially started struggling with, as the title suggests, is freedom. What do we mean by freedom? What policies do we need in place to guarantee people that freedom so outlined in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? Because at the end of the day, that's basically what we are all striving for. But how is it that we can achieve that? And so, what I tried to do is set out to write this book where I attempt to do two things. One is to the very term freedom throughout American history. I think it is perhaps the most powerful word in our political discourse. Yet today, I think that in general, the left has completely ceded the idea of freedom to the right, the language of freedom. When we talk about freedom, we often think about those "don't tread on me" flags, or things along these lines. Freedom from government, freedom to do whatever you want. We don't necessarily think of freedom as in, do we have the proper freedom to go to school, or go to school without debt? Maybe you have student loans, right? Quite a few of you. So I wanted to really rethink freedom and kind of uncover how have we been thinking about it from the founders to today. The second thing I was setting out to do is actually to question what a modern economic Bill of Rights could look like. This notion that today, we often tout that we have civil and political and sometimes reproductive rights, rights that are all increasingly coming under attack. But indeed, those rights are not complete. That if we want meaningful, enduring freedom. And here I just want to pause and say that the right has owned the narrative so well. Anybody know what Operation Enduring Freedom is? It's what the US calls the war in Afghanistan. And I just say that because any term you can come up with about freedom is really associated largely with oppression and war. I don't think that means we should abandon those terms. Just like some of you who've taken a class with Professor Cherneva, you talked about the right to work, how that term has been reclaimed by the right, or claimed by the right to mean, smashing unions. But I think rather than being on defense, we need to figure out a positive vision for what the economy can look like, an affirmative vision for a human-centered economy, and actually fleshing that out, making a positive economic case for it. And that's what I try to do here. Because I don't know how many of you have had to read books through your classes on neoliberalism and how neoliberalism is dead or dying or one nail in the coffin away. But we so infrequently read texts, I think, that really lay out what that affirmative vision is for, okay, what comes next. And it's a big task, but that's what I attempt to do. So I just want to start with a brief story. Back in 2017, Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, came to the United States. And during his time in the US, he crisscrossed the nation, visiting areas in our nation's capital, in Washington, D.C., down to Puerto Rico, to West Virginia, and to here, Skid Row in Los Angeles, one of the largest homeless encampments in the United States. And as a matter of fact, what he saw shocked him. The land of the free, home of the brave that he was told about was not so free in his experience. When he was talking with homeless, unhoused people at Skid Row, when he was watching people open urinate in the streets because they lacked access to basics like a toilet. They had their teeth falling out because they lacked access to basics like dental care. And he was asking, why is it this way in America? And indeed, in his report, he talked about how conditions in America for the poor are just as bad as conditions that he regularly observed in war-torn countries and refugee camps. And this really shocked him. And I just want to point out one thing that really drove this home for me was a year and a half ago, I spent a year in Los Angeles. And I spent my year in Los Angeles a block away from Skid Row. My office was a block away from Skid Row. And every day during lunch, I'd go for walks through Skid Row and just think about, is this the best we can do as a society? Is this truly all we can accomplish? And, the answer was a profound no. But then we have to think about and struggle with, okay, well then what are the policies prescriptions to do something about it? Now, Alston was left wondering, as I think many of us are, why is it like a country like America allows for the persistence of extreme poverty as well as a lack of economic security amidst extreme abundance? When, what Alston was saying, unfortunately, was nothing new. All of us are familiar with the story of the haves and the have-nots in America. We know we're an unequal society. But I think that we need to ask how we got here. Why is this the case? Now, I just want to take a moment to show you a little bit of headline numbers, just to think about how the economy actually is doing. Because when you look at averages, it actually looks like the economy is doing fairly decently. In the 2010s, for example, we had the longest expansion of the economy in history, 128 consecutive months of economic growth. Following the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns, we had the fastest recovery ever on record. And we regained all the jobs we lost in 2 years. Following the 2008 financial crisis, it took us 10 years to regain the jobs. So we really did learn a lot of important lessons. Unemployment today is sitting at 3.8%. That is lower than what most economists call the natural rate of unemployment, or what the Federal Reserve thinks full employment might be. Now, I certainly disagree with their characterization of full employment, and we can talk more about that later, but nevertheless, unemployment historically is quite low. Now, is it low enough? No. Just to give you some numbers, from 1943 to 1945, when the US mobilized our population to fight World War II, unemployment averaged 1.7%. So less than half what unemployment is today. But nevertheless, it's still fairly promising. When we look at consumer finances, FICO credit scores, I know you all are probably just starting to think about what the heck of a credit score is. Pay attention to credit scores. If you do, it'll save you money in the long run. Credit scores are at an all-time high here in the United States, and we have the most millionaires we've ever had. And the average American today is making more than $30. All of these things look fairly good. Now this stat actually kind of astonishes me. The average house in the US today is more than 2,500 square feet. It's grown 60% since the 1970s, and that's a pretty strong sign of affluence across our society. So by the headline numbers, we're doing just fine. Yet, I think these headline numbers, which are often encouraging in many respects, really hide the true economic precarity of tens of millions of Americans. Indeed, it was 1958, roughly 65 years ago, that John Kenneth Galbraith wrote his famed book, The Affluent Society, where he talks about the fact that we have public squalor amidst extreme abundance. Now, when we think about the actual numbers of people living in squalor, back in the 1930s, when Roosevelt proclaimed to see a nation 1/3 ill-clad, 1/3 ill-housed, and 1/3 ill-fed, right? This is in the depths of the Great Depression. We had 40 million Americans in poverty. 1965, LBJ launches the War on Poverty. We still had 40 million Americans in poverty. And today, we still have, again, 40 million Americans in poverty. Now, we have more people, right? Our poverty rate has indeed gone down. But we also have become immensely rich, and we still allow 40 million Americans, well more than 1 in 10, to live in poverty, disproportionately children. 1 in 8 children in the United States are currently living in poverty. And I think the question has to be, why? Why is it that we still have 40 million people are allowed to live in poverty? And what I argue in the book is that poverty is a flat-out policy choice. We choose to have 40 million people in poverty. It is by design. And so a lot of what motivates me is the question of how do we build a society that eradicates this poverty and this insecurity? Now, these are the types of questions that got me interested in economics. And most of you are probably familiar with the story I told so far. Now, there was one shocking development that shook my life, although I know many of you are probably too young to quite remember it, was the 2008 financial crisis. And when the financial crisis struck, people started questioning the economy in ways they really hadn't before, or at least very few people had previously. And you had social movements like Occupy, getting up and demanding an economy for the 99%. But an economy for the 99% was a slogan. And indeed, for any of you who might remember, Occupy got a lot of flack for not having their perfectly formulated 10-point plan. What's your plan to fix the economy? They didn't know. And that's okay. That's not, to me, a fair criticism. What they wanted was a people-centric economy. And then it's our job to go out and think about what does that look like? What are those details? How can we actually structure that? Well, in comes 2015, and this crotchety old man named Senator Bernie Sanders decides to run for president. And he had all of these supposedly radical and wild ideas. Things like Medicare for all, the notion that healthcare should be a right, not a privilege. Things like a $15 minimum wage, or providing college for everybody as a matter of their birthright. And during this time, 99.5% of the economics profession came out and tried to skewer him publicly, saying these were terrible ideas. Their motto was basically, we get that they're decent intentions behind the ideas. These ideas will actually, are both A, radical, and B, will bankrupt the nation. And so as a PhD student at the time, I thought, is that true? I'm going to go out and think about that. And that's basically what I spent most of my time kind of considering. Were those radical ideas? And would those ideas actually, were they kind of economically impoverished? Would they harm our economy? Or would they deliver what Sanders and others had been promising they would? Now, to think about this, as I mentioned, I think we really need to think about what we mean by the notion of freedom. And when we talk about freedom, it's actually quite a nuanced phrase that I think we simplify far too often. And I want to borrow from the philosopher Isaiah Berlin to think about freedom kind of in these two different contexts. Berlin talks about both negative freedom and positive freedom. Now, negative freedom for Berlin is freedom from government. And perhaps the most famous piece of writing ever produced on negative freedom is the Bill of Rights, right? We all read it in grade school probably many times. And that talks about our freedoms from our government. Now keep in mind, right, when the colonists wrote the Bill of Rights, they were not rebelling against a government of the people, for the people, by the people. They were rebelling against a monarchy that was imposing on them. And so, absolutely, negative freedom, right, freedoms from your government to make sure your government cannot oppress you, are crucial. But as Berlin indicates, that's only half of the story of freedom. We not only need negative freedoms to protect us from our government, but we also need positive freedoms. The freedom to live the good life. And those are the freedoms that the government owes us. And the freedom that we all might be most familiar with, and how many of you went to public school, K through 12? Yeah, all right, most of you. That is the freedom we're most familiar with. In every state constitution, we have a right to an education. And indeed, we have a right to an education K through 12. Now what's interesting is, who says it starts at kindergarten? Who says it ends at 12th grade? I mean, those are arbitrary cutoffs. One thing I talk about in the book is how education used to only be free through 8th grade. You used to have to pay for high school. And it used to essentially be privatized like colleges today. And indeed, in the turn of the 20th century, there was a grassroots movement called the high school movement that passed broad-based taxation, property taxes, to collectively fund public schools. Basically the same type of program that we're now talking about in a college for all type approach. Now, these positive freedoms were absolutely crucial in Berlin's vision to provide meaningful freedom. I'm going to quote Berlin here. He says, men who are half-naked, illiterate, underfed, and diseased, to provide only political and negative freedoms to them is to mock their condition. And this is quite literally the condition of tens of millions of Americans today, right? To provide them just political and civil rights and nothing more, and say that they have true freedom, is, in Berlin's words, to mock their condition. So, in comes Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, along with others, was really searching to reclaim this notion of freedom. And Roosevelt, though, for his part, he kind of did this both through the New Deal, which his motto for the New Deal was cradle to grave security. But he did this, most clearly in his 1944 State of the Union address, where he called for a new and economic Bill of Rights. And Roosevelt was calling for this precisely because he thought for Americans to be truly free, to really have opportunity in life, they needed things like the right to a job, the right to housing, the right to education, the right to health care, and more. And one thing I think is really important here is that Roosevelt was not creating this out of whole cloth. He was indeed standing on the shoulders of the more radical founders. In particular, people like Thomas Paine, probably the most radical of the founders, and Alexander Hamilton. Indeed, Thomas Paine argued for things like a basic income, is what we think of today. Thomas Paine was really an original architect of what today we call Social Security. Thomas Paine argued that the government should pay for major life events for people, like birth and death, as well as their wedding celebrations. That these mark important human events, and we should collectively pool resources to make sure everybody gets dignity and gets quality time with family members and community to mark such events. And Hamilton similarly developed what he called this notion of the means proper, that in order for people to be truly free, in order to support a strong state that could in turn provide for its citizens, we needed to develop the capacity of the economy through what we call today basically industrial policy. Hamilton was really the founder of modern day industrial policy in many respects. But what was the goal of that? The goal was to develop human well-being. Right? It wasn't developing the economy just to develop the economy. It was developing the economy to provide for people. And so Roosevelt, a few decades ago, really kind of fleshes out this ultimate idea of economic rights. Unfortunately, Roosevelt passed just a year after introducing the Economic Bill of Rights, and Roosevelt did indeed call on Congress to act immediately. He was quite serious about this call for an Economic Bill of Rights. It was for him the culmination of the New Deal. And for me, this is one of the frustrations about American history. You all probably learned quite a bit about the New Deal again in high school, but I would imagine almost none of you learned about this notion of economic rights, and that this was the kind of Roosevelt's cherry on top to make the New Deal complete and to provide that true promise to the American people. Now, with Roosevelt's passing, the whole notion of economic rights did not fall by the wayside. Indeed, it was championed by the civil rights movement. In fact, after the civil rights movement secured the passage of the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act, King, in particular, along with some of his kind of chief intellectual partners, people like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, devoted themselves full time to the fight for economic rights. And this too is something we really whitewashed out of the civil rights movement, that the core civil rights leaders knew that the vote was only the first step in securing proper freedom, not only for Black Americans, but for all Americans. Remember, when King was trying to work to build the Poor People's Campaign, he was building a multiracial coalition of low-income people to march on Washington and occupy Washington. Set up an encampment was the goal, to demand these economic rights. And similarly, we talked a lot, for instance, about the March on Washington. I'm sure, yet again, you all learned about the March on Washington. One of the core demands for the March on Washington, too, were economic rights. Right? It was the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. And note how central jobs are, well-paying jobs are, to the kind of very core idea of freedom to the March organizers. Now, unfortunately, like Roosevelt, King would die before being able to secure economic rights. He was gunned down while fighting for sanitation workers attempting to unionize in Memphis, Tennessee. Another kind of forgotten piece of history that I think is quite important to highlight, King's final writing, his final piece of writing, was an essay entitled, now I'm blanking on the title. It was an essay entitled, We Need an Economic Bill of Rights, or Towards an Economic Bill of Rights. It was one of those two. You can find it, blanking on the exact title, but which was shocking to me. I had never learned that until I was actually writing this book. That I realized that was literally the last thing that King wrote. It was published after his assassination. Now, this kind of brings us to where we are today. I think that these notions of economic rights that we can tie all the way back to the founders, to Roosevelt, and before Roosevelt, perhaps the president who did the most legislatively to actually enact economic rights was Lincoln, through things like the Homestead Act and the Morrill Act. I, for instance, went to a land-grant school. Roughly half of Americans that graduate from college go to land-grant schools created by the public. The intent was the free education of the American public. But drawing on these ideas, I think, we can really connect to the modern day struggle for what this economy for the 99% truly looks like. And so what I wanted to do was draw on this other economist, John Maynard Keynes, to posit the question of how do we build a society which is ethically tolerable and economically not intolerable. And so drawing on Roosevelt and King's ideas, I set forth to flesh out what an economic Bill of Rights can actually look like in the 21st century. So for our purposes today, I'm not going to go through all the economic rights. During Q&A, I'm happy to chat about some of them. But what I attempt to do is 3 things in each chapter. So I have a different chapter on each economic right: the right to work, housing, education, healthcare. I added in basic income and banking services, okay, for people who are unable to work or unwilling to work for a variety of reasons. I do think that we need to also ensure the right to basic income and banking services. Also, there's this small thing going on called the climate crisis that you might have heard about. So, this wasn't an issue in the 40s. So we also need to talk about what the right to a healthy environment looks like in order to ensure we all have a habitable planet to live and thrive on. And finally, the notion of a right to a union, so that we better embed democracy into our economy. And we always talk about, supporting democratic values, but why is it that democracy is only allowed to operate within the political sphere? But when it comes to the economic sphere, we say no. No more democracy. We encase the economy to protect it from democratic overreach. The whole point of a union is just to give workers say, to give them voice, to give them democratic input, where they spend the majority of their waking hours. So the 3 things I try to do in each chapter are as follows. First, I think it's really important to provide you with a little bit of history for these. I think many people think, oh, we've only been fighting for this idea of a right to a job for the past 5 years or 7 years. No, we've been fighting for the right to a job for a century in the United States. Or same thing with the right to health care. The original intent of Medicare was indeed what we today call Medicare for all. When you go back and read, in the 60s, the writings after the passage of Medicare, the original architects are saying, oh, we'll secure Medicare for all in 2 or 4 years. It's okay, we'll get it. Here we are, half a century later, still having those conversations. So the history is important to realize that we're not alone in these fights, that we've been fighting for these ideas for most of American history. The second thing I try to do is debunk conventional economic wisdom for why these ideas are wrong or bad. So when you talk to a neoclassical economist, or when you talk to a mainstream Democrat or a mainstream Republican, they'll tell you exactly why a college for all plan is bad. They'll tell you we should means test it. We should direct our limited, scarce resources to the least well-off in society. Who can tell me that we shouldn't try to dedicate most of our resources to the poor? Right? So that's impossible to argue against. No. We should absolutely pay for Donald Trump's kids to go to college. No question about it. And I lay out that economic case. And then finally is making the affirmative economic case, so that when you have these conversations with your friends, your roommates, your parents, your aunts and uncles at the Thanksgiving dinner table, you have not just the arguments to tell them why those kind of traditional arguments are wrong, but you're armed with the arguments to make the case for why something like college for all or a right to health care will not only boost individual freedoms, but is also good economics, is good for the economy. And I think that's a component that's often missing. So, just very briefly, I'll talk about the first right, the right to work, just to give you kind of a brief idea of how I envision this. Now, often, I think that it's easy to say, okay, a right to work, you just need to give everybody a job, full stop. But I do think it's a little bit more complicated than that. For me, the idea of actually fulfilling a right to work requires 3 core components. The first is a commitment for federal government to run the economy at what we would call full capacity, or run a hot economy. Okay? It's the notion that historically we have been holding our economy back intentionally to keep workers in line, but instead what we need to be doing is kind of pushing full force ahead, running a hotter economy, and allowing for higher levels of employment across the economy. That's kind of step 1. Step 2 is permanently increasing public unionized employment. The United States, compared to countries like Germany or France, we have roughly half as many of our people employed in public services as other high-income countries. We have an extremely small public workforce. And so I think that we need a permanent expansion of the public workforce. To do what? Provide things like postal banking to ensure everybody has a bank account. To properly staff our schools so that we don't have 47-year-olds to one teacher. To properly staff our hospitals and other public services. And then the final component to ensure that everybody who wants a job can have one is a federal job guarantee, which ensures that we essentially eradicate involuntary unemployment and provide people with the option to contribute to society and to have that dignity of contributing and to earning a livelihood if they so choose. And here I just want to add a quote from Joan Robinson said of Keynes. He supported these ideas essentially because, quote, he hated unemployment because it was stupid, which I just have to say is so true. I mean, think about it. An unemployed person is somebody that's saying, hey, I want to contribute, I want to help, I want to add to our society. And it's us saying, too bad, go sit down on the sidelines. I mean, that is just so wasteful and ruinous, not only to that person, but we're all collectively poor because of it, right? If that person isn't contributing to, improve your campus or your community or, research for the next invention, what are they? So these things all sound nice and good, but when the rubber hits the road, we always get asked a perennial question: how do you pay for it? Right? Whenever you have a political candidate saying, "I have the solutions," be it be it addressing college issues, be it addressing unemployment issues or our crumbling infrastructure, the wise reporter says, "Okay, but how are you going to pay for it?" And I don't want to shy away from this question. I really think that it is the key trillion-dollar question. But when we ask this question, we're really asking two separate things, and I want us to separate between these. And one is we're asking, where will the dollars and cents come from? Where will how will we actually finance it? Where will the dollars come from? But the second question, and I contend the more complicated question, and the question we should be turning our attention more to, is where will the real resources come from? You pass Medicare for all tomorrow, okay? You're going to need a heck of a lot more nurses and doctors and custodial staff at hospitals, and you name it. How are we going to train those people? If we want to actually protect our environment, we are going to need to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels. We do not currently have the electricians, the solar installers, the wind technicians, etc., to do that type of work. How do we educate and train those people? How do we build resilient supply chains so that we can rapidly? These, I think, are the key questions that we should be focusing much more on. So in terms of finance and economic bill of rights, I want to tell you where the money, in my view, I think really comes from. Now, first of all, there's kind of a number of areas that will be utilized to finance an economic bill of rights. And the first and foremost is an increase in government debt. We have sovereign control over our currency. We can indeed issue new debt. And in fact, we have a tremendous amount of control over the interest we pay on that debt. And one, I think, productive development that we've had in economics over the past decade is that many, many more economists than had previously been the case are coming around to this idea that government debt, if it's used for productive investments, and otherwise we're not just handing it out to the rich in terms of larger tax cuts as the TCJA, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act did under President Trump, or we're using it to build schools and high-speed rail and decarbonize building. We're using it for productive investments. In general, those public investments pay for themselves. That's part one. Part two, and this is where I and some kind of people who are also thinking about this idea may have some disagreements, is I do believe we need broad-based taxation to kind of socialize costs. So let me use an example. And this is where I think that, to be honest, I still struggle with. I don't think we have good language to talk about taxation yet. People will ask me, if we adopt an economic bill of rights, will my taxes go up? Yes, yes they will. But that's not the right question. The right question is, if we have an economic bill of rights, will I have more money in my pocket at the end of the day? Will I have more economic security at the end of the day? And the answer for the vast, vast, vast majority of Americans is yes and yes. I'm a professor. I have a good job. I'm very lucky. I pay $830 a month in health insurance, okay, for my copay. Now, if we adopt Medicare for all, my taxes go up $500 a month, okay, to help finance such a program. But I no longer have to pay my $830 a month in insurance, which is effectively a tax. It's true that my taxes went up, but it's also true that I have more money in my pocket at the end of the day to spend on going out to dinner with my family, or buying that electric car, you name it. And so I think often when we talk about taxes going up, we logically think of less money for us. But that's not necessarily the case. And I think we need to develop better language around taxation for that purpose. I'll also just note, I'm not that old. I've changed insurances 14 times since I got off my parents' insurance. It sucks each and every time. I would really like to just change insurance one more time and call it a day. And there are real costs to that. The third area, in terms of how we'll finance an economic bill of rights, is what we call Pigovian taxes. Have any of you learned about Pigovian taxes? A couple, maybe. Traditionally, we talk about Pigovian taxes. They're taxes on what we call social harms. So cigarette taxes, alcohol taxes. The two that I'm particularly talking about in the book are carbon taxes, to help us transition away from fossil fuels, but most importantly, taxes on the rich. We should think of taxing the rich as taxing a social harm. I think if we care about democracy, there are very compelling arguments that having the degree of inequality that we have in the United States actually allows the rich to capture our democratic processes, leads us to a kind of a plutocracy or oligarchy. And so in fact, substantial taxation of the wealthiest and highest income earners in the United States would be an excellent way to help finance the economic bill of rights while simultaneously protecting our democracy. And one thing I want to highlight here, I would really like to see us start having a conversation in the United States about what a maximum income could look like. Indeed, Roosevelt proposed a maximum income in the 1940s, which would equivalent to $425,000 today. I'm going to be frank, I don't know what the right number is. Maybe it's $250,000, maybe it's $1 million, maybe it's $5 million, I'm not sure. But I know it's definitely not what Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk take home. And so I do think we should be thinking about, if we want to protect democracy, how do we limit income? Do we say nobody can earn more than 10 times the average worker, 50 times the average worker? What does that look like today? And finally, I just want to highlight, and this really draws on the fight for the freedom budget, which came out of the civil rights movement, that we also need to think about how to reorganize our budgetary priorities. Our budget is really a moral document. I know that sounds abstract to you, but think about it. The US budget, or the budget of the state of New York, is saying, this is how we're going to put our money where our mouth is. This is where we're sending our dollars. This is what we're prioritizing as a state or as a country. And I would argue that we should move resources, if we're actually start to hit capacity constraints, if we actually start to hit true, genuine full employment, right? But we still need more workers to help us transition away from fossil fuels, for instance. Then we need to be thinking about how to reorganize our priorities, maybe away from subsidizing violence and pollution and towards subsidizing human flourishing. Now, as I highlighted, the true challenge that I see is really addressing this real resource question. How is it that we're actually going to work towards this human-centric economy and do it quickly? We need to think much more carefully about how do we utilize public investments to build out support for the supply side of the economy. And this is exactly what we see the Inflation Reduction Act doing to a degree within the green economy, to use one example. The other area that I think that we need to pay more attention to and haven't gotten deeply enough is how do we actually rebuild government capacity? I don't think the United States government has a great deal of capacity currently. I do think we can rebuild it, but I do think it's a legitimate problem for pushing the type of comprehensive policy reform that I'm arguing for. That if you want to do it and you want to do it well, we need a highly capable bureaucratic system. And we've gone through 40 years of defunding it. And so we need to think about how can we not only put money back into it, right, properly staff it up. I have lots of friends that work in government agencies, and they're always telling me, yeah, we're short like a third of our staff right now. We're not getting it. But we also need to think about how to revitalize that workforce in important ways, giving them the resources, the time, the training that they need to do their job well. All right, with that, I really appreciate your time. At the end of the day, the real constraints are not the dollars and cents, but rather the real resources needed to meet our national priorities. Yes, more doctors and nurses and electricians and teachers are going to need to be trained. Supply chains and efficiencies will need to be substantially improved. But as John Maynard Keynes once said, anything we can actually do, we can afford. Thank you.
I forgot to announce that the students who have this worksheet with the questions, if you would be so kind to just leave them on the way out at the door. We'll collect them at the end, but now I want to open the floor to some questions.
Please.
Hi, and thank you for this speech. It was wonderful. I'm Zaina Khurshid. I'm an econ major engineer. I have a question that, do you think that immigrants affect the economic rights of Americans? And how does it affect the economic growth of US?
Sorry, how does it affect the
Economic growth of US?
immigrants are one, first of all, thank you for the question. It's a really important one. And to be honest, it's not one I engage with much in the book. One of the challenges when you write a book is you have to draw parameters around what's your project and what can you do and what can't you do, what's what we call outside of your scope. And so I didn't address immigration in the book, but it's a crucial question, particularly given the right-wing backlash and anti-immigration rhetoric we're seeing. Immigrants are the key backbone to the American economy. The American economy does not function without immigrants. Immigrants do not take American jobs. Immigrants add to America's dynamism, economic growth, economic potential. So, if you ask me, we need more immigration. We need much more human-centric immigration policies. And most importantly, we need to move away from this false rhetoric that's proven false in the data that immigrants take American jobs or that immigrants displace Americans. That's just not factual. In terms of economic rights of immigrants, it's a question I honestly don't have the best answer to, and it's just something that I need to think through more. One of the craziest things I ever did in my life was go on Fox News and debate Tucker Carlson before he went. He was always insane, but before he went really insane. And this was the exact question on the job guarantee, and this is the exact question that he kept pushing for. What about immigration? What about immigration? What I say is that economic rights can and should be available to anybody living in the United States. That's kind of how I conceptualize it. In general, I do not believe in borders, but how do we actually work towards that world is a question I don't have the answers for. But it's a crucial question.
Hi, again, thank you for the talk and for your time, for being here. My name is Emil. I am also an international student, full-time here at Bard. And just building up on that. So if I, as a Pakistani, would want to work in the US after I graduate, why are there so many hindrances for me to work in this economy, in this market? Because, yes, you guys want to provide jobs. But as an international student, why is it not easier for us? We are also trying to contribute to this economy. Why does the US government not want us to do that?
Thank you for that question. So, you said a few interesting things, and let me just pick up on them. You said, in this market, let us just remember, this is not a free market or anything close. This is a market, the labor market is a market governed and created entirely by government policy. So why is the question, and the answer is because of the rules of the game. Now, that is infuriating. However, the kind of upside to the infuriation of the fact that we basically wrote rules that say, no, we don't have a free market, we have a market where we're going to disadvantage you in your pursuit of having a job in the United States. The upside of that is knowing that we can write different rules, right? Those rules are not written in stone. And so, why were they written that way? Because we are a racist nation. I mean, I don't know what else to tell you. I mean, we are across the political spectrum, I think that there is a strong push to prioritize, people that were born in the United States or people that have American citizenship, and that the United States doesn't have as much of an interest in, kind of supporting internationalism as I strongly believe it should. Again, the upside is that we can push for political change, which is what's necessary to change those rules that govern the economy. The rules that govern the economy are not natural laws. They're politically determined. And that's precisely what needs to be done. I mean, there's again strong data that shows that if we were to allow more immigration and more people that say become educated in the United States to stay in the United States, that our economy would be substantially better off. I also, we are a nation of immigrants, and not only would our economy be better off, but I think we as a society would be better off. I feel very privileged to largely have spent most of my life in university towns, which are very international places, because you get to speak with, meet, befriend, and more people from all over the world, where you just broaden your horizons and learn new things in far more exciting ways than I think would be the case otherwise. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Billy. I'm a grad student over at the Levy. I really appreciated your talk, especially thoughts on why do we only think of democracy in the context of politics and not in the economic space, which is important to me. And it made me think about when it comes to racism, especially in terms of xenophobia and immigration. It's like a form of striding, the economy so that it's harder to unionize, it's harder to have worker power, it's harder to have a democratized economy. I was just curious, I'm at the Levy, which means that I have a very MMT approach to things often, and I usually think of taxation from the perspective of like a pushing and pulling of levers and macroeconomic forces, and not as a literal paying for things, especially at the federal level. At the state level, it's different. But I was curious if the tax portion of this is covered more in your book, because I would love to explore your ideas on the taxation a lot more.
Yeah, so I have the final chapter, kind of just to give you the outline of the book. The first chapter is like where we are today. Headline numbers say things are fine, but when you actually pull back the covers, you see not only are there 40 million Americans in poverty, that's what I focused on in the talk, but I spent a lot of time talking about how the fact that many, many people are one small incident away from being pushed into poverty. Sunday night, second time, I have a 14-month-old, and we got a babysitter for the second time ever to go out on a date, and we got a flat tire on our way. $420. 40% of Americans do not have $400 in their bank account. Right? Literally, that's the difference. I know, I see your face. 40% of Americans don't have $400 in savings. It's shocking. Most people live paycheck to paycheck. And what would they do? I'm lucky that that isn't me. But what would they do? And so I spent a lot of time talking about that. The second chapter is all on neoliberalism, how we got here. And I argue that a big part of how neoliberalism captured the American imagination is through the use and their kind of weaponization of this idea of freedom. Third chapter covers the untold history of freedom, kind of the positive fight for freedom throughout American history. And then the rest of the book basically is a chapter by chapter on economic rights. But the final chapter is the how do you pay for it chapter, where I dive into taxation much more in depth. I agree and very sympathetic to and agree with most of what many MMT scholars write. I think that all of us have ever so slightly different flavors of how we understand kind of post-Keynesian econ, but I'm certainly within that camp, I think. For things like Medicare for all, that, I mean, you're talking 20% of the economy, basically. like, yes, I do think you need to socialize taxation to finance something of that magnitude. And that's why I think that we need a different, and I would argue better language for how we talk about taxation, which I think MMT has done more than anybody else to move forward, especially in the past 10 years. I mean, it's remarkable how much they've done. And so that's not a critique of it in any way, it's just a saying we need to keep going. We have more work to be done. Thank you for the question.
Do you think that true democracy ultimately leads to communism?
I think that true democracy ultimately leads to democratic socialism. Absolutely. I think that if we, all that is saying is that we believe in democratic oversight and control over various aspects of life, and that we should not insulate the economy from democratic control. So, does that mean that you shouldn't be able to own a home? No. Does that mean you shouldn't be able to own a car? No. I don't think that. But I do think that, if we want to actually go to the roots of democracy and deepen democracy, should we allow, when we talk about the 1% is the wrong idea. It's not even the 1/10 of 1%. It's the 100th, 1,000th of 1% that truly control most things. Should we allow somebody like Jeff Bezos to have more control over our economy than basically half of US senators? First of all, we shouldn't have a Senate. The Senate is an extremely anti-democratic institution. That's maybe a talk for another day. No, I don't think we should. So I guess it depends what we mean by communism, which is why it's democratic socialism.
What are your thoughts on the concept of brain drain? Do you think that would occur with high taxes for the rich?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we do have some good examples of this where a couple states have passed millionaire taxes. And so, people want to live in the United States where they, if you tax the rich, where are they going to go? Okay, sure, might we lose, might Elon Musk go move to Geneva or something? Sure. Great, yeah, exactly. I would love, I'm all about his SpaceX program. Please go to Mars, see you later. I think the notion of brain drain is it's extremely important in the low-income, middle-income country context. I think for a country like the United States, I don't worry about it at all. Because I actually don't think those people are that special. I think their money is what makes them special. And if we socialize their money, I don't necessarily think that, we're losing out as a nation. I don't think that these are some great inventors that revolution. Elon did not create an electric car. He basically bought an electric car. Elon didn't even largely finance Tesla. That came from the U.S. government Department of Energy alone. Yeah, but it's a good question. And for the low and middle income countries, brain drain is a very serious problem.
So, do you see that countries such as Norway and Finland, there's a high quality of life across the board, and they also have I believe that they also have better economic rights, and which is in comparison to US. So what should US do to improve on both of these areas?
Yeah, so it's a really important question. One thing I just want to say, and to tie this into the earlier question about communism, is for me, socialism and capitalism exist on a spectrum. And I do talk about this in the book. You ever been to 31 Flavors, Baskin Robbins? Right? There's 31 flavors of capitalism, essentially. You could just think of more or less infinite flavors or varieties of capitalism. And so countries like Norway, Finland, yeah, those are capitalist, right? But they're just further on the spectrum of taking certain things out of the market. So, think about, in the US context, libraries, schools, fire departments, decisively socialist institutions operating within a capitalist economy. And so what should we be doing? I think that there's many things we need to take out of the marketplace. So education and healthcare, I think, should simply be completely taken out of the market. There's no reason I think markets should decide who lives and who dies, and who gets an education and who doesn't. I don't think that's the proper metric, the proper arbiter. And then the other thing I think we need to really be doing is thinking about how do we regulate markets to meet and prioritize human ends. And so the way I kind of think about this is bumper rails for a market. So often, many of the rights that I talk about in the book are trying to set floors in the market to make sure that nobody falls below them. But I also think we need to set ceilings in markets. And this is where I was talking about perhaps a maximum income, right? Where we should say that, yeah, but you need to cap markets where you don't let somebody accumulate too much money, and then because that translates to too much power, and that then erodes again democratic processes. And so I think we need to restructure markets to bound them and allow them to operate within certain limits that kind of prioritize, again, broad-based human well-being. But if you want me to be more concrete, pass the policies that I talk about in the book.
My name's Chris. Thank you. This is a very inspiring presentation. I do have a question about the politics, though, which is perhaps besides the point of this presentation. But
Not at all?
Not at all? Okay. Well, I think post-Keynesian economists have given us a good vision of what is possible beyond the neoliberal paradigm, but about enacting policies, how do you see people move forward and get these things passed? Because, for example, for an economic Bill of Rights, if we're actually talking about amending the Constitution, I don't see 3/4 of states actually passing that in their state legislature. So what do you think about the political question of enacting these things?
It's a crucial question and not beyond scope, so thank you for asking. Lots of thoughts. Let me just start by saying I don't care if this gets enshrined in the Constitution, as long as we pass the policies that will actually deliver these in Congress, that will be sufficient for me. So that's still not a bar we're going to hit today or tomorrow or next week or next year. So that doesn't negate the question in any way. The first thing that I think is really important to note is that people support these ideas. And it's not just Democrats. It's not just people who buy into post-Keynesian ideas or even know what the hell that means. The American electorate buys into these ideas. I worked with Data for Progress, one of the largest polling firms in the United States, to test a representative group of voters across the US on these ideas. And what we found was 80% of Democrats, 90% of young Democrats, 70% of independents, 60% of Republicans, including 70% of young Republicans, support the idea of an economic bill of rights. When I then flesh out legislation associated with each of these rights, it gets majority support from Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, with the exception of Medicare for all. Now, universal health care, okay, that gets majority support from everybody. Medicare for all, the more specific question, does not. Why? Because that has been politicized. This is where Ezra Klein, I think, wrote a wonderful book called Why We're Polarized that really does a nice job talking about how we kind of fall into camps and have become increasingly separated and kind of increasingly divisive in our political narratives. So why don't Republicans support Medicare for all? Go back and listen to Trump in 2016. He was promising to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, what he only calls Obamacare. Right? He wasn't saying he was going to take away insurance. He was saying he was going to take away Obamacare and replace it with something better. Now, that something better was a lie. But in his actual rhetoric, what he promised voters, that was it. And so people want these things. People get economic rights. I think these are kitchen table issues. And so I think what we need to do is figure out how do we get to voters and build mass movements in support of these ideas. They do have some champions in Congress. So I work with Representative Jayapal and Lee in Congress. Jayapal is the head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, represents Seattle. Lee is a representative from California. And they actually introduced a resolution that included a call for an economic bill of rights last year. So it's getting a little bit of attention on the Hill, but is it going to pass anytime soon? No. And so I think that we need to continue talking about these issues with voters and continue pushing policymakers to adopt kind of this framing and these ideas. Now, one of the reasons I wrote the book the way I did is precisely to try to build political coalitions. The book, and this is the main reason I don't talk about immigration much in the book. the book is a little nationalist in its rhetoric. And I want to be like honest and upfront about it. And the reason is because my question is, how do we get voters in Ohio, in Minnesota, and in West Virginia on board with these ideas that I know that they support? How do we sell those ideas? And I think people are proud of America. And I think that they want to be proud of them. And I think part of our job is giving them a bit of an alternative history to latch onto and see that these ideas that we're talking about today don't only come from Finland or Norway. And yes, I think we can and should learn from our international partners, no question about it. But they also come from our own struggles we've had here in the United States since the very start of the conversation about what is America. And so I think leaning into that cautiously is important.
So my question kind of relates back to your question about brain drain, but it says more about business wise. So you talk about possibly limiting the wealth accumulation that people could acquire, but wouldn't that just kind of make other countries and nations a lot more attractive to move businesses over there? I know that transition could be very difficult, especially with economies of scale, but that's still what causes a lot more harm, I feel like, to the U.S. economy. So I'm wondering how could you make that more attractive for businesses to stay here within the U.S. instead of looking for other opportunities elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a great question that I also don't dive into in the book, but it's a really important question. And international tax cooperation is one of the biggest things that we need. And then the other part is just like maybe the U.S. might need capital controls. It might actually need to limit the ability of businesses to relocate, right? And that's something that we absolutely can and should entertain. But yeah, it's an important question. Now, I mean, I think if the United States adopted a lot of these ideas, that wouldn't be an issue. I think if they adopted all of these ideas, then you might be talking, about more issues in relation to, companies who are trying to relocate. But in general, the United States is still one of the largest economies in the world. Still has one of the most educated workforces in the world, and companies do want to be here. Yeah, it's a great question.
I'm Diana, and thank you for the presentation. So my question is, how increase government debt? How increase government debt relates to government spending?
Yeah. What about it exactly? What's the
Does
concern?
it have any relation with government spending? Does it increase it? Does it decrease it? Increase
Okay.
government debt?
Yeah. So, in terms of the debt, often what you read in the news is what's called a debt to GDP ratio, looking at the size of the debt in relationship to the size of the economy. That's, I would argue, is not the right question. The question we more care about is how much does it cost to service our debt in relationship to the size of the economy. So for instance, if you have, $20 trillion in debt at 2%, and your economy is growing at 3%, that debt will never be unsustainable. If you have $20 trillion in debt and the debt is growing at 5% and your economy is growing at 2%, you might have more problem. So we care a little, much more about the cost of servicing the government. Now, the problem is that neither of those numbers, before I get into that, just to be clear, a country like the United States, it cannot run out of money. It cannot default on its debt from an economic standpoint. Those are only political challenges, right? Like when the U.S. almost defaulted, a few weeks ago, that was a political challenge, not an economic problem. The political struggle can create an economic catastrophe, but there's no actual underlying economic problem with increasing the government debt. So that I think is really important to highlight. But the other thing in terms of increasing government debt for these types of things will all increase economic output, will increase the productivity of the economy. So if you're increasing debt while simultaneously increasing economic output, again, in the vast majority of cases, you're not actually growing that ratio. because yes, you might be adding to the numerator, but you're also adding to the denominator. So government debt is not a bad thing. It's not something to be feared. We need government debt. I think, I do personally think that there are unsustainable levels of government debt that we could indeed potentially flirt with. This is why I say things like Medicare for all should indeed be financed out of broad-based taxation. You're talking whatever it is, 18, 19% of the economy. But I think that in general, as long as government debt is going to finance productive investments, we really don't have anything to worry about.
Last question.
I'm
Sure.
so sorry for another one. So I do a lot of research on this sort of thing, specifically automatic stabilizers and job guarantees in the developing context. And one of the things that we butt against, either from an MMT perspective or from a traditional perspective, is from the financing perspective in a developing context. If it's from the MMT perspective, it's like there's a lack of sovereignty or whatever, you have balance payment constraints. But from the traditional perspective, there's just not enough money. And how do you think that these ideas can apply to low and middle income economies, and is it possible to get to these levels of social welfare and support there, and what would that look like more, and if there's any difference? I don't know if it's out of the
It's a little,
relevant
it's a
context.
super important question, and thankfully there are a lot of much smarter scholars than I thinking about these questions. That I would suggest you read. You're probably familiar with Fidel Cabu's work. Is who I would point you to. That's doing some great work in that realm. I just focus a lot less on developing country finances, so I just don't want to, don't want to reach too far beyond my pale of comfort. But I do want to say this is not something I think just the United States should be fighting for. That's not at all, what I mean. I think that, if we want kind of economic liberation more broadly, we need to be working on securing economic rights across the board. And I think the notion of, low-income countries are too poor to afford these is wrong. I do think that there are much larger coordination failures and challenges in low and middle-income countries than we might face in the United States. And overcoming those are very, very real. And that's why I, again, point to, for me, most of the challenges exist on supply, on the real resource side. But that's not to say they all do, particularly in countries that, face the fact that we live in a dollar hegemony, that's quite real.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Leave your worksheets on the way out. There's more food behind you, so grab some on the way.
I appreciate all your fantastic questions.